August 26th meeting of the Hollis Brookline Cooperative School Board to order. We normally meet on the third Wednesday of the month, but given the current COVID situation, there has been a deviation from the normal meeting schedule. We've been publicly releasing all of our meetings, and they're now here, and hopefully we'll be meeting more regularly in the future. I'm Holly Darrell-Babcock. I'm the chair of the Coop School Board. We have Beth Williams, Kate Stoll, Krista Whalen will be joining us momentarily. All three members of the school board. I don't think that the camera goes around, but Rick Barnes and Tim Perzone are here, principal of the high school and principal of the middle school, respectively. Tim has stepped away for a second. Oh my God, Brian. Yeah, Brian. Here, Bumpus is here.
Wow.
I can't believe I did that. I just couldn't bring it forward. Brian Bumpus is here. He's our athletic coordinator. Cindy Van Conen is here, also known as the school board. Peter Brooksop and Thompson is the superintendent of school and superintendent Corey is here. We are accepting Tom Solon, I hope, soon. And Liz Brown has an excuse absent. At this point, I'd like to appoint a process observer. That would be great. Cindy, you did it last time, so that can do it this time. That'd be great. Thank you. Do you have any agenda adjustments?
Are you not?
The only thing I would like to do is at the end of the meeting, like before the update or after the update from the process observer, I'd like to just do a little agenda building, if that's okay, just so we can see what's coming up. That will only take, I promise, a couple minutes. Okay. At this point, I guess we should approve some meeting minutes. We have the cooperative school board's minutes of August 12th. We had Kate Stoll was absent. There was an amendment offered to replace and on page 7, line 30, replace the word and with the word and. I need a motion to accept as amended. So moved. I've got Cindy as moving and Beth as second. And again, Kate, you need to really stay on this one. So are there any other comments or clarifications? All in favor? 4 and 1 abstention. 401. I also need a motion to accept as presented the non-public meeting minutes on August 12th, 2020. Moved by Beth, seconded by Cindy. Are there any comments on those? Okay, so all those in favor? Got 501, and Tom Solon has entered at just for the 604. Okay, nominations, resignations, and correspondence.
I just wanted to provide the board with a quick update. The last 2 days we've had new hire orientation, and I'd like to thank Kerry Lash and her new hire orientation team. They did a great job. We did a wealth of in-person as well as some Zooming. So it was a nice combination of the two to really give our new teachers a flavor of the district as well as kind of get them prepared for anything remote. And I'd also like to take a moment to thank our guidance staff at the high school. They provided our transfer students with a really nice day today. Wealth of students, probably a dozen to 15 that were transferring in. They were made to feel most welcome. I got to meet a few of them, and it was really just a nice day. And again, it's really interesting to watch our students who have been with us and how they're already accepting the protocols and showing up and doing the tours and doing everything they did. So I want to just commend both of those groups and thank Rick and his staff for really making the kids feel welcome in less than ideal temperatures. That's it.
Thank you. I just want to make a comment that we continue to receive many emails, and we completely appreciate the public input via email. Many of those questions and comments have been included in our reopening, and we'll be addressing some of those tonight. Discussion. Okay, great.
this point, we're going to talk a little bit about public input itself. Public input is an opportunity, let me make sure I'm on the right spot. Yep. Public input is the opportunity for the public to comment on a specific agenda item. We accept public comment during the public input portion of the meeting. Once the chair has opened the floor for public input, please state your name and address. Please address your statements to the board chair. Please keep your comments directed towards items on the current agenda. Public input is not a question and answer opportunity for the public. We'll be noting your questions and comments and may be able to answer some of those questions during the discussion portion of the meeting. We are asking that you keep your comments to 2 minutes, and we'll let you know when you've reached that point. Finally, I think I've said this many times, this has been a challenging time for all of us, so we hope that you will remain respectful. At this point, even though it's a smidge early, if someone walks in the door later, we'll navigate those waters, but I'll open the floor for public comment. Seeing none, I will close the floor for public comment. And we will move right into discussion. And I believe that kind of turns the floor over to you, Mr. Gordy.
We're going to start off with, Gina's going to give you an update on some staffing needs for reopening.
So turn the floor over to you, Ms. Gordy.
Thank you. So as part of our reopening plan, we have a number of students back in the building, roughly 81% here at the co-op. Some of our teachers, for a variety of reasons, will be teaching remotely, and as such, we will have the need for some supervision in the classrooms. We already had the approval at one of our, was it the last meeting or the meeting before, for 2 permanent daily subs. We're looking to add 4 more for a total of 6 to help cover the supervision and attendance needs of those classes. And if we are able to obtain those, then we can continue with our reopening plan as presented.
Great. Thank you.
May I ask what percentage of the teachers are coming back in person to teaching remotely?
The vast majority. I'm just trying to. Do I know how many teachers we have off the top of my head? I would say over 95% of our teachers will be back.
Okay.
95%?
Mm-hmm.
In person?
In person, yeah.
Great. In the middle school and the high school?
In the middle school and high school combined.
Combined.
Correct.
So we're looking for permanent substitutes, or are we looking for, like, would this be I don't know how to ask this. Like, this person has this job, or are you just looking to every day you know you're going to need 4 substitutes, so you're adding to the substitute? So you're asking for more money for substitutes. Do you understand my question?
Yes.
I'm sorry. It's very.
So the 2 permanent daily subs that we had asked for, we said we could cover within our substitute line because we never actually utilize the entire line item. Looking at the model, we will need to have essentially a daily substitute in a classroom who can identify who's present in the room, supervise the students, and turn on the projector and turn on the Zoom session for the students if the teacher happened to be teaching remotely. Right. So it would be a regular occurrence,
right?
But we, kind of piecemeal them together to cover as many teacher classes as possible. So it's not necessarily a 1-for-1.
I understand. So would it necessarily be the same? Would the same substitute be in the same room every day?
Ideally, yes.
Ideally. Okay. Don't know.
But the same substitute might not cover all of that particular teacher's classes.
Right. They might rotate through and have their own set schedule because you have different
right, just because we're piecing them together.
Right. Makes sense.
It's a puzzle.
Go ahead, Tom.
Are you're going to be asking for funding for this?
I do believe that the total of 6 daily subs would exceed the line item for substitutes. So yes, I'm asking for.
But would it exceed the budget because I'm assuming that you're going to have, you said you're going to have staff that potentially are not teaching.
So
I'm
we have
assuming
an
there's
open
gonna be
position.
some funds there.
I'm confident it'll be covered within the budget. We have one part-time position that became open, and we haven't filled that, and that was a part-time position of a, fully certified teacher. So I'm confident we can cover the funds. It's just positions, multiple ones, that weren't identified as part of the budget, so we're asking for permission to have them.
But we don't technically need to approve that, do we?
No, it's going to be, the money will come from the operating budget. It's more of an understanding of exactly what will be happening, because as we reopen, there'll be some staff members who medically aren't allowed back in the building, so that these permanent subs will be with us until either, this dissipates and moves away, or until it goes the other direction and we're fully remote. And to Gina's point, we actually have an open assistance position at the high school, which we would just transfer to be one of these positions. And then it was a .7 position at the high school that we are not filling. So we believe the four of them, which will be approximately $15,000 apiece, will be covered within the budget. But wanted to make the community and the board aware of this staffing issue, because this is the biggest piece to reopening, is the staffing piece. We'll also be potentially using some larger spaces like the gymnasium or the multipurpose room or the auditorium. In some cases, we may double, put rooms back to back because of supervision, so that one person could potentially supervise two rooms, because it's more of just a supervision piece. We're not looking for really direct instruction. On the other end, if I talked at the elementary level a little bit, their need is more of a few teachers based on how their numbers split, and they need direct instruction as opposed to supervision.
So in that context, now I certainly appreciate being notified of how it's being accomplished, but this sort of seems like not necessarily micromanaging, but microanalysis in the sense of having to, setting a precedent of approving every time you make a staffing rotation. Since it doesn't impact budget, the plan has been approved, and all of the things that you're proposing doing fall within existing board-approved actions. I'm not in favor of going through and having to check the box every time you decide you need to do something.
Right, and I don't disagree with you. I'm just want to be as transparent as possible for the community. So if you elected to just say that you've already voted on this because it was part of the plan and not do it during deliberations, that would be fine. I just wanted it reflected in the minutes, because let's say 2 or 3 other things happened during the course of the year that took the budget into a negative.
Right.
At least this way we have in the minutes that people were notified that these expenses were coming up, and maybe it's the next one we didn't plan on that could be a big expense, and where would that come from? Now, the board is also has a contingency fund. We're not asking to go there yet. We may at some point. And then the board increased the unreserved fund balance, and we may need to go there. But we're a long way from there. But I think if you don't walk the community through the story from beginning to end, and you just arrive in late May or June saying, oh, well, it looks like we're going to be in the red, that's going to be a major concern.
So did you say that each substitute you think would be $15,000 a year, like for the whole year?
Yeah.
And if you create, would you be creating permanent positions? And if for some reason COVID just magically disappears and we're back to completely normal, would you be obligated to keep that person in for the rest of the year?
So that, the answer to that is not as simple as it seems. If COVID disappears, we would also need clearance for our staff to return from their medical providers. So there are a couple factors. But if assuming that takes place, then yeah, we would not have the need for it. Also, assuming we go in the opposite direction and we're fully remote, these are guaranteed daily subs for in-person. So we would no longer need the positions if we were fully remote.
Okay. Is there any other board members who wants to weigh in on whether or not this is a decision the board needs to make in terms of voting? Because this is under our deliberations, and I mean, we can discuss it now. Anyone else? I mean, I tend to agree with Tom. I'm not a big fan of micromanaging every decision because there's a lot of decisions that you have to make. So, but if I also want to support whatever you feel like you need to move forward. So if it's something that you felt like you needed us to vote on, I can go either way.
Well, I
Sorry.
certainly appreciate having it put out in our meeting, talking about it in our meeting, and certainly having it in our minutes, so I agree, so that it is documented, that it's being discussed. I think that's information that's good for us to know, because those are questions that we get asked, and it's good to be able to answer those questions, so. Whether we vote on it, I agree with Tom, I don't want to micromanage you guys in any way, but at the same time, I appreciate that we're being given the information.
Yeah.
And I have no problem if you decide not to take a vote. It's just, I didn't want to add a deliberative item, and then the community's like, well, they voted on something and they didn't give us any notice.
Right.
Right.
This way, it was noticed that you might take a position. If you don't feel that's necessary, then that's fine.
I mean, I feel like, to Tom's point, we voted on a reopening plan that includes students going to school every day, and so in person every day. And so in order to execute that, you need substitutes. It makes perfect sense. I mean, anyone, when you think it through, it has to happen. Like, you're going to need extra bodies to make up for the bodies of people who are teaching but are at home teaching, or, so yeah, that makes sense.
I just have just one question. I agree completely. I just am curious, we're talking about 6, and that sounds totally understandable and reasonable, but is there a point when we should be voting on it? Just before
Right.
you say it, just because if you're talking about 6 or you're talking about 26, there's a big difference. So I think I agree with what Tom's saying, but that's my only question.
The issue would be
what would that
over the
when we
budget.
need to alter funding requirements or some
Perfect.
existing policy is now in jeopardy.
Yeah,
Right.
perfect.
And
Okay.
then one other question about substitutes in general. I should know this because it's probably in the support staff contract, but are substitutes, do they have prep period, do they get periods off during the day, or can a substitute, when you bring them in, cover 7 periods? Or every block?
They can cover every block, but they do have a lunch.
Okay. Do they get to eat?
They do. We let them. It's a luxury.
Cindy knows. Okay. Okay. Are there any other questions or comments on that? This was are there any other questions about staffing needs for reopening, or?
Well, I do have a question about it. Based on the description that you gave of the responsibilities, are you looking for people with any level of certification or things for this? Okay, so you're going to be a little bit more relaxed in what the credentials would be for this, correct?
Right. It does not require experience in education or a credential. We provide all the training right here.
And these people will act mostly as monitors of the classroom, attendance takers.
Yep. Attendance, supervision, and essentially turning on
Right.
the district device and the overhead projector.
Okay. Any other questions on reopening, staffing?
On reopening in general?
Well, no, this was an update on staffing.
Okay, you just said.
I know, but that's what I said,
Okay.
reopening, staffing. I said, any questions on reopening, staffing?
Okay.
Okay. All right, are we good with that? All right, so the next item on our agenda is the athletic plan. And again, we're not voting, we're just listening to you and want to hear it, but we will probably have some feedback.
Is the version in the agenda packet the updated one, or should I go to the updated document?
So the agenda packet is the most up-to-date version with kind of one change that had come about from a meeting that we had yesterday.
Okay.
That I'll discuss, I'll elaborate on a little bit.
Okay.
So basically, what is in the packet is a framework that Ron Rupp, Allie Bushman, Mike Thompson, and I put together to, kind of guide us in delivering an athletic experience as we look to reopen schools. within that packet, really our first steps when we sat down to look at this were to develop some policies and procedures to help guide us in 4 really distinct categories that drive our athletic programs. Those categories being health and safety, how we're going to handle our practices, how we're going to handle games, and how we're going to handle transportation. So I'm not going to go through point for point, but I would like to highlight some of the more pertinent points in here. Essentially, a lot of this is being pulled from guidance from our different governing organizations, whether that's the state, the NHIAA, or the NFHS, as well as points from our district reopening plans. So what you see in here really are things that we felt needed to be elaborated on, or really highlighted out of those particular pieces of guidance that we're working with at this point. So as far as health and safety, one of the things that we've had a lot of success with over the summer through our conditioning and skills work has been the setup of hygiene stations in our gyms and at the fields, in the weight room, and those include sanitizing spray, wipes, paper towels, pretty much anything that you need to clean equipment, and make sure that all those procedures are being followed. Kids are sanitizing hands when they're entering and exiting any facility, whether that's a gym, the field, or the weight room. So we'd like to continue with that. We're certainly we're not gonna allow any community water coolers or bottles. That's something that's being pulled from other guiding documents that we've kind of been handed. And I know that equipment, how we're going to handle equipment has been a big question mark. So one of the things that we've discussed is, we're certainly going to encourage our athletes to leave bags in their vehicles whenever possible. I believe that the hope is to offer more parking, at least at the high school level. So hopefully that will help, eliminate at least some of the storage needs for equipment. But beyond that, our plan is to have designated areas where different teams can leave their equipment on a daily basis. So currently we have the storage container that sits outside the cafeteria at the high school. That storage container is sectioned off, and one side of that storage container is going to be solely for our football equipment. So when the kids come into school in the morning, they can drop that door will be open, they can put their equipment in there, and it's just football players that are going to have access to that. Beyond that, we feel we can manage our other team's equipment, being a lot less than football. There's not the helmets and pads that we need to deal with on the shelving units outside of the locker rooms at the high school. So each team would basically be given an assigned shelving unit, and that's where their bags go. And there would be we obviously would have to monitor it, but there would be no intermingling of bags at that point once those are in place. Practices, in regards to practices, our plan really is to push the start of practices back by 30 minutes on any given day. This allows for any sanitizing that needs to take place after school, and any health checks that need to occur, which we would be requiring of our athletes and coaches prior to participation. We would also place more restrictive time limits on practices. So typically, we varsity practices will run about 2 hours, and JV practices about an hour and a half. We would cut those down to an hour and a half for our varsity teams. JV and middle school intramural we'll talk about a little bit later, but the idea would be that any of those practices would be limited to an hour. And all teams, regardless of how we reopen, would be subject to the return to play protocol that Mike Thompson has developed for us, which is included in that packet as well. As far as games, which this is obviously a big topic here when we start talking about procedures for game days, again, a lot of this guidance comes from the NHIAA and NFHS as to how we are expected to handle games. But again, there are a couple of pieces in here that we feel were important to really highlight. One was our visiting team. So it's our intention to close off our locker room access to any visiting schools. This seems to be a common theme across the state, and we would require that any team that is coming to play us arrives ready to play. again, in all the athletic director meetings and NHIAA meetings that have been happening, this has become the norm. You know, pretty much every district is putting this in place that's planning on reopening. And the expectation would be that those schools are going to follow any and all of our sanitation procedures that we have in place for our school district. I don't know if that's the right word or not, but and then as far as spectators, so one of the big issues that we're going to run into is transportation. So we're struggling with how we're going to handle transportation during the week. So as far as spectators go, one of the things that's being talked about is that a lot of districts are going to be relying heavily on parents to transport their kids to and from games. And we didn't think it was right to shut those parents out of a game if they're driving their kids to and from. So our take on that is to allow 2 spectators per player and coach from each team, from the home and away teams. And our plan to monitor that is to implement a what I would call like a guest list almost, where each school prior to traveling to our school and each team of our own would be required to provide a guest list that we would use to check spectators in as they arrive for any of our games. So the goal is to host any game that we do play at home on the turf. So we think that's the easiest way to be able to manage that type of system. You know, if we start looking at playing games on any of our other fields, it's going to be pretty challenging to keep people kind of corralled and you know, implement that checklist process. So that would be the ultimate goal here. Transportation. So when it comes to transportation, our plan really is to limit as much weekday travel as we can. In those instances when, you know, transportation does kind of rear its ugly head and inevitably becomes an obstacle for us, our hope is that the athletic office would kind of have the ability to grant permission for parents to transport their student athletes to and from games. And in instances where a parent wouldn't be able to transport their own student athlete, to allow them to travel with another parent. So that's kind of the gist of transportation. And then we took a look at our current eligibility requirements that we have for our student athletes. Our proof of physical and baseline impact testing requirements are only valid for 2 years. One of the things that we've talked about is, given kind of the current state of affairs, we felt that it would be beneficial to look at extending the expiration on both of those items to 3 years for this year only. I know that a lot of people are having trouble getting in for their physicals at their doctor's offices, and trying to manage impact baseline testing at the high school is going to be pretty challenging with all the changes going on in and around the buildings, and trying to get into a computer lab and social distancing and all that stuff. So our hope would be that we could extend those to 3 years, and we also are looking to have all of our student athletes sign a COVID-19 risk agreement that we would include as part of the Family ID registration process. The one that's attached to this document is adapted from one that Pinkerton Academy had developed and sent out. So our hope is that we would be able to use something like that when we open Family ID for parents to sign off on. So that leads to kind of the bigger pieces of our plan. So once we had established our policies and procedures, we really dove into kind of the nuts and bolts of how we're going to make all this work. So first, we really looked at, you know, what can we do within our own district to be able to implement an athletic experience. And we came up with this 4-tiered approach that you'll see outlined in that document. Those tiers from top to bottom there's an interscholastic tier, which is where we would play against teams from other schools. There's an intramural tier where we would play against teams from within our own school district. There's a skill development tier, which would basically just be a continuation of the conditioning and skill workouts that are currently happening. And then there's our remote tier, if we ever get to that point, which hopefully we don't, where we would encourage our coaches to hold Zoom sessions with their athletes, excuse me, and we would implement programming similar to the HB Open. To us, the major benefits of operating in this fashion really are that it allows the opportunity for us to pivot and transition through the different tiers throughout the year, given the circumstances that we're faced with and the situation we may find ourselves in, and still allow us to really connect with our student athletes, which I feel we lost a little bit of that, obviously, this past spring. And then our second component that we took a look at, and this is where things get a little bit different, was how we would implement an interscholastic schedule. So one of the things that's being talked about across the state is playing regional schedules and only playing schools within your area. So our thought initially was to form a cluster with us and 3 other area schools, and basically we would guarantee each other a 6-game schedule throughout the fall. So we would play each other, home and away for the 6 weeks of the playing season as it currently stands. Unfortunately, that plan completely fell apart on us because, as it goes, every day it's something different, and schools are not, they're dropping at their athletic programs, and we really found ourselves in a situation where we just didn't have a 4th team that fit with us naturally at that point. So yesterday we had a meeting with Milford and Souhegan, and we came up with a new concept where basically we're looking at forming 2 pods of 3. So the first pod would be us, Milford and Souhegan, and the second pod to kind of form the southern cluster would be Pelham, Campbell, and Sanborn. And basically within your pod, you'd be guaranteeing the other schools in your pod 2 games apiece, and then we'd look to fill out our schedule with schools from the other pod. So that way we at least are all playing the same schools. We're still trying to keep it as local as possible, but we're not eliminating opportunities for our kids to participate. So at this point, theoretically, all the schools involved are on board with it. We're still kind of ironing out some details as to what exactly that's going to look like in terms of scheduling. We're also trying to establish, we're actually meeting, all the athletic directors are meeting tomorrow to establish, based on this document, policies and procedures that all of our schools are going to agree to follow for all of our games. And, once that's kind of in place, the hope is that, again, like I said, theoretically, everybody's on board. So the superintendents from the meeting yesterday, agreed to it at that point, although I know they need to go back to their boards and, figure out from there what they're going to do. So, the one thing from that plan that is in the board packet is the schedule, which we do intend to follow for our own schools. So again, playing games on Saturdays where, we're hopefully going to host, for one Saturday, we're going to host boys, girls soccer and field hockey, and spread those out throughout the day on the turf so that there's at least an hour gap between the end of one game and when another team shows up. And then play our football games opposite, just to keep people, it'd just be too much to try and squeeze 4 games in. And yeah, that's that. So I'm ready for questions.
Brian, before you do questions, could you just touch base on volleyball, because it's the Division
Oh,
I
yep.
sport?
So volleyball is kind of the outlier here, so I actually have that in the bottom. There are 4 sports that really were kind of, don't really fit into the model that we've put forth here. Our unified soccer, just trying to schedule a weekend game for unified soccer is going to be very challenging. And I don't know we don't know yet what other districts are doing in the way of unified soccer, if they're gonna continue on with it for the fall, or if they're gonna look to kind of go towards more of an intramural model within their school, which we would certainly be open to. Golf is a sport that we just have no control over the availability of our golf courses. We're stuck with what they can give us. So that's one that, we can't really dump into that scheduling model. And then bass fishing, they only really compete in the state tournament, so this doesn't apply to them. And then volleyball plays in Division I. So volleyball is the one sport that we would be playing some different teams that aren't within that cluster, but still sticking to an area schedule. So, the national is Merrimack, Bedford is a school that has jumped into mind, potentially Goffstown. So there are plenty of area schools that we can play in volleyball.
Hey, okay, does anyone have questions? I have questions, but.
Yeah, I just have one actually, or two parts. So in talking about the health check that's going to happen before every practice, I'm
Yep.
assuming the same health check would happen before any game?
Sorry, you mean the questionnaire?
Yeah.
Yep, it's going to be the same. So we wanted to make sure that there was continuity between, what the district is doing in terms of questionnaire and what we're doing for our student athletes.
Okay.
And ultimately, with student athletes coming from remote learning into athletic practices, it just makes sense to just redo the questionnaire at that point.
And then is it just a questionnaire, or will there be a temp check along
There'll
with
be
that?
temp checks as well.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
So, I have a few. I assume when they're practicing, they're not wearing masks, but is there masks requirement, during getting ready,
So the current guidance from the state is that masks need to be worn when not engaged in physical activity.
So on the way to practice, during health check, while you're getting ready, while you're changing while you're.
Yeah, I mean, and, theoretically, they're gonna be changing in the building anyways, so
Right.
they should be wearing their mask in the building, so, yep.
You've got some limits on spectators, limits on, who's at practices. We have a lot of volunteers that help with coaching. Are we limiting them as well?
Yep, so Carrie and I have actually gone back and forth quite a bit on this, and basically it's my understanding that we're gonna take volunteers on a case-by-case basis, and there's not gonna be a guarantee that everybody's gonna, get in, so to say. So, there's gonna have to be a need. People are gonna have to justify a real need for that volunteer
Okay.
in order to be involved.
Because when you're limiting spectators at games and
Yep.
parents parents and step parents can't necessarily all go to watch a game.
Sure.
But you have multiple volunteers, it's a mixed message of what are we doing here? And
Yep, so right now, the really honestly, the only cases that I could see that really being necessary are if we look to go to an intramural model in any sport. The idea and the concept would be for soccer, for example, is that we're not gonna play 11v11 in soccer. We just
Play
don't have enough
7v7,
kids
right.
to support it. So we would go 7v7, and at that point, if we're doing that at the middle school, we only have one middle school coach.
Right.
So we would have to recruit some volunteers in order to
get
be
it.
involved in that capacity.
A couple more. So if we're gonna extend, and maybe this is a question on the policy committee, but if we're gonna extend the impact testing, expiration, is that policy? Do we have a impact test policy, or is that procedure? Okay, that's a question that we'll bring back to the policy committee. So I just asked myself a question in public. That's great.
I do think it's a procedure.
It's a procedure, you think? You don't think we don't have a policy on impact testing? We have, okay.
Is there any NHIAA governance in impact testing?
Nope. It's all school-based.
I have a couple of questions.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm gonna have something else. Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, just on that note, the laxing the physical and impact testing, I think that's perfectly fine. in the agreement, it asks parents to make a statement that they are generally healthy. So that kind of covers that first, the physical. There is no question in there if there's been a concussion in the last year or something like that. That could be something that could be very easily added, because I think the impact testing is very valuable, but it also could be waived for most athletes. It's probably not been an issue this past year, but that's potential in there. I think overall the plan was really, really well thought out, and I think everything's done very, very well in here. I would hope too that it is a fluid document, I know as everything else is, that you know, there may be needs to tighten restrictions, but we also might hopefully be able to loosen some of the restrictions for various reasons as we progress. The only questions I really had were on the last page, like the, you know, proposed agreement waiver. Specifically under the assumption of risk and medical clearance, the last line of that, the very, very last line of that second paragraph, basically says, my child will not participate in activities until their symptoms have cleared and they have produced a negative PCR test for COVID-19. My thought process on that is just, that is far, far more restrictive than return to school. And I just wanted to clarify that if that's the intention of that, because return to school does not necessarily mean all symptoms have completely cleared and you have a negative PCR. So I was curious, that's one question, is that intentionally far stricter to return to sports than it is to return to the classroom?
So to be honest with you, I can't answer that
That's
question.
okay. No, that's okay.
This was something that, like I said, we adopted, you know, we kind of took this from Pinkerton, so.
Sure.
I can
Sure, and
offer.
I can, sure.
I know with our back to school, we are going to ask students to produce a negative test, but we know that in some cases they may not be able to do that. And again, I just read the athletic, I read it as the same that we're talking about with the return to school, that we will ask you to get a test, we hope that you do, but in the absence of that, you know, you still have to quarantine and you still have to be within the DHS guidelines for returning to school.
Sure, and just to kind of clarify then specifically just on the negative PCR, so if you have a negative PCR, that's pretty simple, it's a negative PCR. If you have a positive one, the state has, you know, guidelines and algorithm on things and when you can return, but it does not, and the state does not recommend a negative PCR to return. The reason for that is if you have a positive one, you can stay negative, or you can stay positive for weeks to come. So realistically, if you have a positive PCR, you are asked to stay home and isolate for 10 days. And if you meet the 3 steps of the criteria, which is it's been 10 days since the onset or the test, your symptoms are improving, not gone, but are improving, and you have no fevers for 3 days consecutive to that last 10 days, then you can return. So having a student, whether it's an athlete or a student in a classroom, teacher, coach, whatever, you test positive, you have to meet the state criteria to return, not a negative PCR. So that's the sticking point for me, is a negative PCR is not realistic unless you're going to keep people out for 4+ weeks, 6 weeks. It varies. Some people will have a positive test for 2 to 3 weeks. Some will have them for 4+ weeks. So that's why I was asking specifically on that. So maybe the language be more along the lines of, you know, the state guidelines for return to school or return to play, because it's reasonable to ask for a test. It's not reasonable, in my opinion, to ask for a negative test, because if you're positive, that's a different algorithm and that's a different process that you have to meet. And along that same lines, it's the, you know, just keep in mind, my concern with the symptoms have cleared is the same thing. And I think anybody would agree, if you've ever had a cold in the winter, you know, you might have a fever and everything for a couple of days, but you might have a cough for 3-4 weeks. The cough is the last thing to leave. So the state does not say you have to be symptom-free to return to work, daycare, any of that, but it has to be improved. So I think instead of nitpicking the language, we should focus more on the state recommendation for return to classroom, return to school, return to sports or work, whatever, but it's not that language. So,
So this document can still be tweaked, I assume?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we're not
This
voting
hasn't
on
been-
it,
This
so
hasn't been
it's,
released,
right.
so, yes.
Yeah, and I think if you mirror the language that's in the reopening plan, as Beth has indicated,
Yeah.
Right.
I think that you'd be on
it would
much
be
firmer ground.
consistent.
Yeah.
I think that's fair. It's not, and I think, you know, we can always talk about the testing requirement too, because like you said, right now currently the state does recommend if you're symptomatic, you get tested, but there's also a 10-day isolation for families, staff, adults, whatever, that can't afford to test, don't want to test. test not available, whatever, there's options for that too, but it's not just a test, but. One last question on the release waiver, that bottom part, just the last line of that, and I don't know, I know Liz isn't here and I know nothing about any of this, but I'm just asking, the release for this, is for any type of claim, including breach of contract, negligence, fraud, so is the intent, like, is this kind of similar to language we've already had for school sports, or is this just related to COVID? Because COVID and fraud and negligence and all that, some of that seems to go together and some of it doesn't. Like breach of, I was just curious what that language, if you could explain a little bit more about the language in that.
Part of it is centered around what other schools have used historically. And as Brian said, this was provided to us to give us a starting point. But I think, that sentence and the one you just referenced above, two places that we can go back, talk to our own legal counsel, work with Brian in that. Because again, the goal is to have any student whose family agrees to participate.
Sure, okay, I'm a little confused about that language, and if we can just get better explanation or kind of tweak that, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Happy to do that.
Thank you.
So, just a silly question. Will students be able to watch or spectate or no?
So at this point, we're saying just.
No, okay.
Yep, so we are fortunate that in the high school gym, we do have the huddle camera. So, which, I don't know if anybody took advantage of it this past year, but we were able to live stream basically the whole second half of our basketball season this past year. So volleyball games, we would be able to get up on that same live stream. Huddle is not quite there yet with an outdoor camera. They have some prototypes in the works, but not quite ready to release them yet. But the intention would be as soon as those are ready to go, that we would jump on one of those as well for the turf so that we could get those up on the live stream. So.
Go ahead, Tom.
Brian, thank you very much for putting this together. Thank you for the complete team. It's very comprehensive and helpful. You talked about the goal of getting parents to drive and potentially allowing parents to drive other students as well. How would that be mapped, if at all, to student drivers? Are you looking to allow students to drive themselves to events and potentially carpool?
Not necessarily. There are like extreme cases where students that are 18, with principal permission have been allowed to do that, but we're not necessarily prepared to travel down that path.
So you're not rolling that into the request?
What's that?
You're not rolling that into the request at this point?
No. I think at that point, if we ever got to that point, which hopefully we don't, we're hopeful that if we can get this weekend schedule off the ground, it's going to eliminate 90% of our transportation issues. We may run into an issue with cross country during the week, because that's really the only time that we can run those races. But it's going to be very limited. We're talking maybe 3 meets that they would have to try and work transportation for the whole season. So
we've historically allowed students to drive themselves to off-campus practices, I know.
Oh, yeah, probably.
And I know our kids did for swim team
Sure.
for years.
We don't allow that for ski team.
And we also do it for a CTE thing. So, Andy, do you think it's feasible if needed?
I think we could review going there. I think what I've seen from our families regarding the daily transportation to and from school indicates that they're more than willing to work with us. So I think the key is the Saturdays, because I think that would free up possibilities for families, and to coordinate if Bob and I are neighbors and our kids have been hanging out or they're friends and they're going with the Thompsons that particular day and they're coming home with the Thompsons, we're going to make those accommodations. But I think it would be very rare, and typically when those happen, the request comes in to Brian or Ron, they bring it to Rick. Rick and I usually have a conversation and evaluate it on a case-by-case basis. We still, especially if it's Saturdays, have access to transportation, and could go one child a seat, and that would be 23 children on a bus, which would be appropriate social distancing. It would put the windows down for that. And for many of our teams, that's more than adequate because, if you're looking at a varsity soccer team, it may be 15, 18 people. So that works really well. So I think the transportation piece, again, was to kind of get out all the possibilities and know that we would be granting Brian and Rick and Ron the ability to kind of make some of those decisions around the circumstances as they come up on a weekly basis. And from my point of view right now, we're looking to put a varsity program out there. We're looking to allow junior varsity athletes to train, and we're in our discussions trying to figure out what kind of competition might look like for them. And right now, I would tell you that the middle school to me is an intramural program until I gather more data and see which direction this is heading in. So when we say we're looking to start a season, we're looking to put our varsity teams out there, have our junior varsity teams practicing, because some of those students may qualify to move up depending on circumstances. And if in an ideal world, if things improve, we would do things like maybe playing a fifth quarter or different things like that to get those kids guaranteed minutes so they're just not practicing all the time. Now, that might not happen every game, but Brian and Ron would work with the other ADs to make sure that our kids who are participating also get that sense of competition.
Great. That was kind of my next question was, but you've kind of answered it. You have this chart with a tier that you're going to choose which tier each team is playing. At this point, are you kind of approaching it from every team's playing, like all the varsity teams are going interscholastic at this point? That's sort of what you're, and that's the goal.
Yep.
Okay.
So varsity would be interscholastic, and like Andy said, JVs would be in that kind of skill, not necessarily skills and drills, a little bit more robust than just skills and drills, right? When we talk skills and drills right now, we're only in small groups. We would still allow them to practice as a team, but with the intentions of kind of reevaluating as we get things off the ground, just to see where we're at and how things work, what works, what doesn't, what we need to adjust before we are really comfortable with jumping full in on something like that. And then running back to the volunteers for the middle school, running intramurals at the middle school level.
So I want to reiterate what Tom said. Thank you so much. I mean, I know this has been a ton of work and a ton of planning and your team of people. And I still have a couple more comments and questions, but just I want to make sure you know that I totally appreciate all this hard work, and I do remember your name. So I know crew isn't mentioned in this because they're a club, so my guess is that is anyone talking to them, and are they making plans, or?
I have not had a
assume-
conversation with
okay.
crew, but I would anticipate that they're gonna follow the same policies and procedures, most likely that we're.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I actually also sit on the crew board, and
Oh, okay.
we
Thanks,
are.
that helps.
Yeah, so we are planning on a modified season, probably non-competitive, given that a lot of other teams, schools have pulled. So, but we might be able to set up scrimmages as things go, but right now we are hoping for something modified schedule, both at the high school and the middle school.
And I mean, I know this is kind of off topic, but we're talking about the athletic plan, the athletics extracurricular. I mean, we've put together sort of an overarching view of, a bird's eye view of extracurriculars, but I assume, will we be hearing a little bit more in depth on that, or is it just gonna kind of work its way out?
Are you talking about for the school as a whole?
Yeah, I
or?
mean, like all the extracurricular stuff that the kids want to get involved in.
Are you talking about extracurriculars or school, opening a school? I'm confused.
I'm talking about extracurriculars.
Okay. So it would be the same opening letter that I would do for every year, but obviously a lot of extra things in there to include about signups and those types of things and expectations for those activities and how they, kind of fit in with what we're doing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. That's it. And then finally, I just want to say, I would support this no matter what, because I do support sports, but I'm very hesitant to support interscholastic competition. I understand that people care really strongly, and that is a big part of sport, but it is a risk, and we're taking risks. And I just hope that we can, I understand that this is the drive for the kids, and it's really important from parents, and I get it. I do get it. But I just want to go on record as saying that I am concerned about the level of risk when we start to mix with other schools, because I really think the most important thing is that our kids get to be in the building, learning from teachers together and each other. So I 100% support extracurricular, intramural, time together playing sports. But you can play sports, and you don't have to win, and you don't have to beat another team to know that you're good at it. So that's just, anybody else?
No, you just say
I know they're playing everywhere.
It's not that they're playing everywhere, that's not important to me, but I just want the community to realize if you're an athlete and we say there's no sports, you're not stopping playing. You're going out to the seacoast, you're playing on your club team, you're doing all that. At least this way, I know the guidelines are by us and they're monitored by us, and we make those decisions. I think it's very difficult as a parent to make these decisions now. I think Brian's crew has put together a tremendous plan that will allow us to stay safe and do the best we can, knowing, and that's why we had the athletic directors and superintendents on the same call, that if we need to say we're not playing the following weekend because of cases or something, that's the step we will take. So this is absolutely about safety first. We're going to move forward. We have ample time to continue our training and to prepare and to talk with our athletes. But I think what we're going to see, which I saw today from our student orientation, is that our students truly want to be back. And they will do their best to comply. I'm not saying they'll be perfect because they're kids, but they will do their best, and I think our athletes will also do our best, whether it's us or Milford or Sauhegan. I think they all know that we're kind of all in this together, and by conforming, we actually continue our season. I also would say that we're not having any policies for the child who gets out at 2:30 and goes and works at Market Basket, or the child who gets out at 2:30 and goes to the mall. So in one sense, I have a group of students that I'm going to control till about 6 o'clock every evening, which I think really allows us to mandate those protocols of washing hands and all the other pieces, the mask. So I know it's not an easy decision. It's one that I haven't made easy. Brian and I have spent countless hours talking over the last couple of weeks, but I do think it's right for our kids. I happened to meet 2 soccer players today up at the field, and they are like overjoyed and ecstatic. Not because they're going to win or lose games, but they're going to have an opportunity to play.
I hear you. Gotcha.
Holly, just one quick comment on it too. I agree completely with what Andy said, and the fact that we have that ability to, in a moment's notice, make a decision to stop things or alter things based on % positivity rates, not just in our community, but we have like live data daily that we can track. But my comment, I think that your concerns are completely valid, and they're questions that should be asked. But on that same token, I support this wholeheartedly with the playing within the smaller groups of students, different leagues, because ultimately our physical health, our mental health, all of it's linked. Our immune system, we need this for so many reasons. So
I never said it wasn't for the whole plan.
I'm not suggesting you weren't for the whole plan. But that's a big part of it, is the competitions and the and I know for my athletes too, that's why they do it, and it would be hard for them to not have that. So I support it wholeheartedly. I think it's a really well thought out plan that we use well. Awesome.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for all the work.
Thanks for listening.
Great. Awesome. Okay. Update on anti-racism and equity work.
Yeah, I just wanted to provide the board a quick update. I've done a wealth of research in my spare time around this topic, and I've looked and talked with a couple different programs and consultants. And at this time, I just wanted to give the board my thoughts and a little bit of my direction moving forward, and take any questions or comments that you might have. I've decided to approach this from a strategy of similar to what we've done with the pandemic. I'm going to put together an advisory board for the superintendent that I'll reach out to community members because we have a wealth of experts in our community. And I'll start with a core group. And that core group will work with me, and then we'll expand that into conversations and forums and discussions across the SAU. And then at that point, we would start to come back with recommendations to the group. I did look at a consultant. The fees around that are very expensive. I mean, just to gather the data for about a 2-month period of interviewing students and things like that to get data is about $24,000. And to go through a year with a consultant would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $100,000 to $150,000. And I think when I look at where the budget's at right now, based on what we need for staffing and things like that, as well as I'm not sure if they'll give us a better product. I've been very impressed by the format that Gina and Bob helped to construct around our reopening plan and everything, and I think it's a format that we can use on this critical topic. I think from a co-op school board, it aligns very nicely because we're pre-pandemic, we were discussing our vision for what a Cavalier should look like when they graduated high school. What were the qualities and things that we want our students to graduate with? And to me, this becomes a piece of that. It becomes a K-12 piece of that. And we've already started pieces. So for people in the community, we have teachers who have already started to lead book groups. We've had teachers who have talked about what can they put in their curriculum, or more importantly, what do they already have in their curriculum? Because many of our teachers already have lessons geared around literature and things like that that discuss these difficult topics. So how do we put an emphasis on that? So my plan, hopefully, if everything goes well, is to, when I come back for our regular September meeting, kind of give you an update of what the committee looks like and who they are, and then kind of work with you and the other 2 school boards and kind of move our way forward to our goals and objectives, and as we go, incorporate those elements into the strategic plan so they're not just a one-shot hit for one school year, but more it's here's our next 5 years, what it looks like, you know, and then we can look at ways to how we track our own data. The other piece is, as Bob reminded me last week, is we had already started to incorporate the Choose Love program, and that program was a lot about people's mental health, but there's a component of that program that also talks about these elements. And rather than, you know, have multiple things going on, we're going to look at the Choose Love program and see how we, as a school district, can incorporate specific items to help us move the ball forward on this critical area. And I'd be happy to take any comments or questions you may have, and you probably expect updates once we get started, like every other month.
Any questions from the board? Comments?
Would the advisory board, would it be one for elementary, one for the co-op, or an advisory board for basically SAU?
I'm looking at it as SAU, and I'm looking to probably start with, I'd say, maybe 6 members, somewhere that size group, along with Bob, Gina, and I doing different parts of it. And then, based on our discussions, expanding that to select people. Maybe we're looking for something on curriculum. We have a group in the community, as we know, that teach at the college level and have dealt with a number of these things and have expressed interest and willingness to help. We have many attorneys in our communities who have said, you know, I'd be happy to help look at your handbooks and your policies and things like that regarding that. So it's got to be kind of, you know, an overall picture of this, and it will probably result in some sort of statement by the SAU or something about these are 2 or 3 things that we value. And why do we value it? Because we expect our students, when they graduate high school, to have that skill set, so no matter where they go in the world, they have that understanding of how to discuss difficult topics.
Is there anyone else?
No, I just thank you for the information, and one of my biggest concerns with the resolution was that it basically implied that we had to hire a consultant, and we didn't know costs, so I appreciate having more insight on that, and I think that this is a really great place to start.
And you're not
appreciate it.
saying the consultant's completely off the table. You
No.
get an advisory committee, and if they say, wow, this is too much, you might need to bring somebody in.
Yep.
There's potential.
Right, and I think the other thing is, if you bring somebody in, it's a targeted piece, or you're trying to gather data, and you need somebody to help you construct a survey or some mechanism to use with the community, that, to me, would be a good use of resource. Then bring it back to the board for board approval of things like any questions that may go out or things like that. And what's the purpose of the survey? What are we actually trying to get at? Sometimes, we see a lot of surveys and they answer a lot of questions, but we sometimes reflect and wonder what was the specific purpose. So there may be a role for a consultant, but it would be on a very specific type of item.
Are there any other comments, questions?
That's something else I'd like to discuss with Rod on this topic.
Okay. Great. I think that sounds like a good starting point, and we'll hear more about it in September. So that's great. Okay, I have nothing else on the discussion.
I know, I thought it was gonna fit into something else, but you chose not to.
I did?
It's more on the general
reopening.
reopening than
So
on the specific.
Okay, so would you like to move back to just a general kind of?
I have a very specific
Sure,
question.
just ask the question. Go ahead. Good.
There have been a lot of emails and stuff going around, particularly around the last meeting's activities around face coverings, and I'm just looking for clarification on what was decided last month, if I can proceed.
Sure.
My understanding from what was presented and moved forward is that the default policy is in the co-op, face coverings will be used, but that there is an allowance for relaxation under some circumstances within the classroom. Is that accurate?
I think there's the potential ability for the relaxation, but I think that key piece that we added, and by the way, the same language was adopted by all three boards. But the key piece is, and whenever asked to do so by an employee, we have sample posters that we can get printed identifying some rooms as 100% mask zones regardless, and then individual rooms may have an opportunity, but it's really like if it's identified now as a good time for a mask break, as opposed to the assumption that anyone can take it upon themselves to take a break other than maybe a sip of water.
Okay, so it's not a situation where a staff member or adult employee or something can say, okay, we have sufficient social distancing in this room, therefore masks are not required. That's not a permissible situation?
They could deem a mask break as an
Not a break, just saying.
Well, the break could be, there could be a 45-minute break. What is the break? But yes, that is a possibility if the adult in the room deems that it's an appropriate time given the guidelines are adhered to and able to be followed. The trick, though, that I would point out is we're saying when physical distancing is possible, but if we are 20 students in the room with the distancing, the moment a student gets up to use the restroom, they've walked through those 6 feet, so then it's an automatic mask on. So there's that caveat.
So the one complexity in that I'm curious about, if the adult in the room says that it is okay to remove masks for whatever period of time, and there is a student in that classroom who is uncomfortable with that, what is the expectation of what are they to do?
I can.
Their mask on?
They can certainly keep their own mask on, but if
The masks
they're
that
not.
we're putting on don't protect the individual.
Sure.
from the outside.
Right. So I would say that if any student is uncomfortable about anything, not just a mask, then they could go to any trusted adult in the building. That could be school counselor, that could be the building principal, that could be the teacher, it could be any number of things. I would also say that we have multiple teachers in classrooms, so there has to be an understanding that all of the teachers in the same classroom share the same understanding about what's acceptable for a mask break. So if, let's say, there is a student and they've shared that they feel particularly uncomfortable with that relaxation or extended break, then all of the other students in all of the other periods in that classroom shouldn't be made aware of that particular student, but should be made aware that this room now, that's just not a possibility. For whatever reason, they won't necessarily know the reason, and that's the expectation is that that's acceptable.
Okay, so if a student is uncomfortable, they can make that known, and that can become the overriding
Absolutely.
practice for the room. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And I'd also just like to add, when I say keep a mask on, I understand the difference, Tom, but I'm suggesting that for some people, they may feel more comfortable with an N95 that protects them, and that's fine. Some of our students might be wearing, a gaiter or different things, and there should be creating an atmosphere where we're respecting that. So it's, if they say you can take off your masks and 12 of the kids do and 3 don't, I'm hoping that we're creating that culture that it is completely acceptable if you're wearing an N95 and you keep it on, or you're wearing it. It's a tolerance or respect, but that's also another option, but of course we want students, teachers, everybody to come forward if they're uncomfortable, but that's another means of protection, is changing the kind of mask that a student or a teacher wears and wearing an N95, as it does protect you and others. So there's other options.
Great, good point, thank you.
Yeah, I think we have received a lot of emails about face covering, so thank you for that clarification. Okay, at this point, I don't think we're going to deliberate. I think we're going to let you guys bring in your people without voting on that. So we need an update from the process observer, and then we'll do a little agenda building.
Sure, everything. Yeah,
Does
unless you.
anyone object to us not deliberating?
Nope.
Does anyone object to us not deliberating?
Nope.
Sorry.
We're good on that, thanks.
Okay.
I can read their eyes.
We give thumbs ups too, right? Okay. No, everything zoomed right through at the beginning, and then took a little bit longer in discussions. We took almost an hour in discussions, so that 30-minute discussions is probably not quite enough for us, knowing our group. But other than that, everything's smooth. We made up that time by great. Yeah.
Thanks. So agenda building is more just about kind of preparing us for, it sounds like we may need to meet one more time before our regularly scheduled meeting due to potential things that are going on.
Can you guess?
So do we think that might be next week?
It could be next week. I would think that we'd try to get it done since teachers come back Monday. I know we're continuing our impact negotiations, and I know Attorney Clausen was in touch with the unions today again.
Would that actually be a meeting versus a non-meeting?
It would be a meeting because you'd be formally voting on that. Now, you would have you could have a non-meeting and a non-public. You could do a variety of different things.
So there's that. So I just wanted the board to be aware. And then our next regularly scheduled meeting would be the 3rd Wednesday in September, and we're hoping to have some policy on that. And then I wanted to make sure that we included some conversation about the anti-racism work that you are going to be starting on. And then are there any other topics that board members have felt like it's just been a really confusing 6 months, and we've had a lot of things that we planned on addressing that we haven't had a chance to, and I just wanted to give everyone just a minute. I'm sorry I didn't prepare you. I thought of it as I was walking in the door, but to think if there's something that we're missing or, yes.
I'm going to need to give you some sort of kind of projection for FY22 budget.
Right.
And then I hate to say it, I think it would be prudent on us to discuss early what we would be doing in March if for some reason we weren't able to have an annual meeting.
Right.
So I don't know if it has to be September, but it needs to be on the horizon to make sure, because it'll be here before we know it.
So annual meeting could be sort of under future agendas. And then the other thing is that I know we just passed a policy where we would have a class size report out in May. Clearly, everything's been in flux, but I would think maybe we should be talking sometime in the fall about having sort of updates. Since we're middle school and high school, I mean, obviously you're going to have some kids who are remote and some kids, but I'm just kind of curious what topics and what subjects and what people have signed up for and what our numbers look like and that kind of thing. So, and it is
General review.
right,
Opening day.
right. So,
And I think that same token, because we had talked about having that update in March and then again in October to see what actual numbers are.
it was May and October. But
May and
yeah,
October.
okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, May and October, yeah.
So maybe it would be October that we would
Yeah,
be
it would
looking
actually
at
get,
sort of seeing your class sizes and, having more information on that.
Yeah.
And I'm not even really that curious. I mean, I'm not so much curious about like who's in the building and who's not in the building, but I'd like to know like how many kids are taking AP Bio, how many, and how did our sections play out in terms of that kind of thing. But
That's
there
for the
anything
regularly
else?
scheduled one?
What?
For the regularly scheduled meeting in September?
I think the October meeting is the policy, so we skipped the May report out, but in October would be great. So, and then we need to talk about the top 10 at some point. So we were planning for that in April. So we need to either maybe put that into September or October, depending on how much we are getting through in September. Yeah.
yeah, no, just, you already covered the policy, because those in particular. And then the other one that I know I always harp on, but like Tom had a question today that didn't quite fit in. The one thing that doesn't quite fit in, there's so many good things happening, and I want to have some kind of, even if it's a 5-minute thing on the agenda for calendars or what's happened because of things that board members or principals or
stuff.
anybody, the good
Yeah,
stuff. Like,
no,
it's really
I
important to
agree.
highlight that and be able to talk about that. And I feel like right now at the meetings, I can't talk about some of the things I've seen or done in our district because it doesn't fit into a box. That'd be awesome. Thank you.
Will there be a student rep this year?
I believe we had a student rep, but I mean, there was a young woman who came to a couple of meetings. Is she planning on
I believe so.
Okay.
So when we come back,
in September?
yep.
If you can send out what policies you guys are working on?
Yeah, I've been doing that, but I'll do that again. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've been trying to do that. We did not have a policy meeting in
I
August, so, but we're going to try to, giving the policy committee a heads up that we're going to try to have one in September, so. We will be having one in September,
Can we tell,
I hope, unless something bad happens.
can we tell
Stop. Stop that,
definitively
Holly.
at this point whether or not the top 10 discussion's going to occur in September so that you can start getting people together for it?
Yep, I think so.
I mean, I think the way we left top 10 was that you sort of had it was on your plate to present to us in April.
Right.
So I think if you
It was
would like
all
to
but-
get it
it
ready
was
for
ready to-
September.
Right, it was ready to go, it just
It was
never
ready to
went.
go.
Yeah.
So I think it sounds like we may have time for it at that September meeting. Just prepare for a long one, people.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, is there anything else? All right, so I think we need a motion to go into, do we have a non-public tonight?
Yes, we do.
So, and then we're gonna go from non-public, we'll make a motion to adjourn and then go into non-meeting like we did the last time, right?
Correct.
And what is the, is it compensation, dismissal?
Reputation.
Okay. So I need a motion that the board by roll call go into non-public session pursuant to RSA 91-A:3, section 2, C. To discuss a matter which, if discussed in public, would likely affect adversely the reputation of a person other than a member of the body or the agency itself.
So
Second.
Moved by Tom, seconded by Beth. I need a roll call on that. I'm going to start with Krista.
Krista, aye. Kate, aye.
Beth, aye.
Tom,
Holly, aye.
Cindy, aye.
Okay, great. So that's carried. So we are now in non-public.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
We'll take about
7:20, is
I
that
have
right?
7:19,